It seems like he's trying to squeeze as many droplets out of what people consider to be their most definitive Batman. And this time he comes with a Batmobile. And not only are both boasting the gold label branding, but also are marked as McFarlane Toys Store exclusives, which is awfully strange considering that Rebirth is, again, a very high-selling portrayal of Batman, not just in the comics, but as we can kind of tell, the McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse figures ever since they first got their first taste of the shelves back in 2021 with that first release. So here we need to break down exactly whether or not it's worth picking up as a package deal, getting them separately, or just opting in for the Batmobile, considering that this is now, I think, what, number 4, number 5 of seeing the Batman. And considering that fact, I think it's really due for a direct comparison in this regard. So first, let's tackle probably the easiest thing to kind of get out of the way in regards to McFarlane's last-ditch effort here to tackle a little bit more of the Rebirth line. I honestly don't know exactly where all this came from, but he decided to give us what is, I think, version 5 of the Rebirth book here, not including the retooling and the Frankensteining of it to then give us the year 1 Batman, so to speak. So keeping it strictly to just Rebirth, these are essentially the ones that I kind of wanted to showcase in a very direct comparison. I understand that there's technically a 5th one missing in the form of a Frostbite edition only available at GameStop, but considering that it's quite literally a gimmick figure with just translucent blue plastic, I think that kind of speaks for itself. It's pretty obvious exactly where it's going to differentiate. So I figure that this is probably going to be the broadest pick of the litter in regards to what many would consider their definitive Batman if you were to looking at the Rebirth approach to this aesthetic. So we have, of course, at the very far left, the first iteration of the DC Rebirth Batman. I want to say it was like early 2022. This was back when he was releasing figures, not just at the standard $20 price tag, but the back art on the art on the back of the box would simply just be a photo of the figure again. And I'm like, all right, why did you do that? So after a little while, they got better with that. But then you'll note that here in second in line is going to be practically the very direct comparison to that original version, considering it's like 95% the exact same figure, only this time with a lighter shade of gray, no black accents on the utility belt, much more oranger outline to the bat symbol, and then of course a cleaner look to the head sculpt with a much more saturated mouth plate, sans any kind of facial hair, and that's predominantly about it. And this version was included inside of an Amazon exclusive 3-pack that also came with Batwoman and also a Clayface mega figure. And that was practically your only access to this figure, but I still thought to include it in here since it's kind of one of the iterations that people may be on the hunt for, though it's got its very niche approach to it. And that's probably why they opted in for this aesthetic. It's not particularly my favorite, but it is what it is. And it might be for some others. Then you have at the far right here, the Digital version that is pretty much the one that's probably going to share the most DNA with this brand new version that is now a McFarlane Toys Store exclusive, which many have deemed it to be their definitive Batman. And they've definitely spoken those words with their wallets, considering that the figure on its own is completely sold out on the McFarlane Toys Store. At the time of this recording, if you still want to pick it up, the only method to do so is to buy it along with the DC Rebirth Batmobile that we're about to cover as a 2-pack. So you're going to have to take that giant thing with it, and along with it also that much broader price tag. So you're gonna have to shove out those buku bucks. But the reason for why that is because now you're pretty much kind of Frankensteining certain aesthetic choices of these two into this guy, along with certain attributes of this guy. Because you'll note that, of course, the biggest differentiator with the Digital is that he's predominantly blue for the gauntlets, boots, cowl, and cape. And you're missing pretty much all of the purple aesthetics from those first two releases, but you're still incorporating the same sculpt work as far as the body, the cape. But then we get a little bit different with the head sculpt. You'll notice that this guy's got a much more different head sculpt than these first two releases, and that's exactly what this guy decided to lift from. You'll note that the Digital in this brand new MTS exclusive with the cloth cape has the exact same head sculpt as far as the much broader appeal to the sides of the head, the mouth plate, all the different aesthetics that give it this much more broader, much more aggressive physique, as opposed to the much more leaner, straightforward look to the original DC Rebirth and then the Amazon exclusive. is much more different, and it's shared between these latter two. Similarly, you also got the same colorway being shared between these two for the utility belt. All four have the exact same sculpt work behind that utility belt as well as the body, but you'll notice that you got the black accents along with this much more opaque kind of gold design, airbrush metal to the look of the utility belt as opposed to the mustard yellow, very solid yellow to the first two. Once you get down to the body sculpt, essentially it's the exact same thing, down to the lining of the boots, the gauntlets, and then here, for the sake of posterity, I decided to swap out certain hand accessories to then match the previous two, because now you got the same hands for the fist on the left and the gripping trigger hand on the right. That is aesthetically and sculpt-wise the exact same all across the board here. And since the sculpting of the body is practically the same across all four, then the articulation is going to follow suit. So I'm not really going to break it down here joint by joint like I tend to do. So if you guys want to catch much more in-depth looks at the articulation, either check out my original somewhat antiquated review in terms of like the presentation values there of the original DC Rebirth Batman from a few years back, or a little bit more recently, the DC Rebirth Digital version that is then incorporated over here, that also serves as a form of comparison between this guy, these prior to releases, and also featured in that video is that aforementioned Frostbite edition that actually makes an appearance in that video. When it comes down to this brand new version that is now being re-released, it's predominantly the head sculpt that is then lifted from this guy. So now you get this sculpt as far as the face values, as well as the aesthetics of this guy for the black of the cowl as opposed to blue if you weren't vibing with that aesthetical look, as well as the much more opaque gray to the suit. This time we got a much more darker solid gray that's kind of like an in-between these two. It's not as bright as this, but also not as dark as this. So when it comes to the very clear differences that sets this guy apart, I think the most obvious would have to be the felt good cape in the form of a nylon that is double stitched with black on the outside and purple on the inside. So it's kind of replicating the look, almost as a form of ping homage to this original releases here, but still keeping it very DC Rebirth centric. So I do like that approach. I don't like that once again we are omitting a wire inside of the cape, which had me fooled for a second because again, it was double stitched, it was very refined as far as the way that it was pleated here at the edges, which was then leading me to believe like, oh wow, it feels pretty strong. I'm guessing there's a wire in there to be able to then put it in predestined poses, but unfortunately it doesn't seem like that's the case. So it makes it all the more disappointing to see that there is a spot in there for me to fit in a wire, and I know that I can technically do it myself, but I'm also not a company here. I'm just an individual, which makes it much more confounding that a company like McFarlane Toys can't simply just put a wire in there. I just don't get it. And likewise, I also don't get why they decided to opt in for a simple paint app for the bat symbol. I'm sorry, but that's another demerit I'm going to have to give to this brand new version of the DC Rebirth Batman. I understand that a lot of people look to it as their definitive, but one really strong suit behind these three prior iterations would have to be that you can actually have a sculpted bat symbol on the top. You have different approaches as far as colorways. You have, of course, black with much more mustardy yellow outlines or gold yellow outlines for these prior two releases. And then again, this kind of much more opaque, shinier aesthetic to the yellow that kind of matches the utility belt for the DC Rebirth. But it's a simple paint app for the brand new version. It's got also a different sort of bend to the bat symbol from a design standpoint, from a drawing standpoint. It kind of looks a little bit more angular. I would almost argue a little bit more pared down and less badass looking. But to me, the more insulting part is the fact that it's simply just a paint app. I simply just don't understand if you guys were able to do sculpted before. I don't know if this is maybe something that they had to cut out of the overall budget for the creation of this guy to give us a felt good cape, but at the same time, then I'm sorry, I would probably have made the executive decisions to simply just not do this. But I understand that you practically have to sell what is also the big showstopper over on the site right now, which is to be that DC Rebirth Batmobile. And to complement that Batmobile, you need to have a Batman that can naturally fit inside, and you're practically not going to be able to do any of that with rigid rubber capes via these three prior versions of the DC Rebirth Batman. You're going to have to resort to a cloth cape so it can naturally and organically fit inside of that cockpit. And so that's literally the main driving point as to why this guy exists in the first place. And, you know, my respects to people that consider this now their new definitive Batman. Like I said, it speaks volumes to the fact that this guy on his own has completely sold out on the site. But I think there could have been some other opportunities to take advantage of in order to make him as definitive as other folks make him out to be. Especially since he's already taking so much from the prior iterations, not just for the body, but also for the accessories. Quite literally, all 4 of these are utilizing the exact same Batarang and the exact same grapple hook. The only differences would have to be maybe a few color changes as far as the Batarangs with certain airbrush finishes or paint deco overhauls. Hell, the one that comes with the Fidgetal here is completely decked out in gold paint, so a gold kind of semi-chrome aesthetic to it for both the Batarang and also the grapple, which I guess from a logical standpoint doesn't really make that much sense. But not only do you have those two, but when it came to these two guys, they were stuck with the left fist and the right grapple and hand, and that was it. When it came to these two, specifically the Fidgetal here, which made it a bit of an appealing piece for myself, it would have to be that he came with not only the extra trigger hand and the extra fist for the opposite orientations, but he also came with an extended 5th hand. And they decided to abide by that with this inclusion. That's one thing that I respect, is that they didn't cut out any prior accessories that we have already achieved with the Fidgetal. You got all 5 hands, the grapple, the Batarang, okay. Cool. But likewise with the Fidgetal, he also came with that alternate Bruce Wayne head sculpt, so now you also have that option. Not much has changed from the Fidgetal iteration, so the paint application, the sculpt, the likeness, completely 100% the exact same thing. So this time you got the opportunity to get that there without having to resort to the Fidgetal. So that is a plus. But right now, like I said, the big drawing factor is the fact that this guy could fit into the DC Rebirth Batmobile. Let's take a look at it. And I understand what exactly is happening here with me covering this Batmobile. David, you're more or less going back on your word when it came down to the last Batmobile that you covered on the channel, which was the Robert Pattinson 2022 Batmobile. Just a very quick TLDR explanation. I believe the Pattinson Batmobile went up for pre-order, and then just a matter of like a week or so later, the DC Rebirth Batmobile here went up for pre-order, but naturally, because of that order, I got the Pattinson finally delivered first. Got a little disappointed with it, as that review remarked, and so I thought to myself, okay, with the pre-order withstanding, I really am trying my best to not get any more of the Batmobiles, and the only real exception would be if maybe there's like a really massive deal that's too grand to ignore through Ross or DD's discounts, just like the most recent White Knight Batmobile, or as it's much more recently been discovered, the animated series Batwing for just $60, almost a whole $100 off. That would probably be a better justification. Regarding the DC Rebirth Batmobile here, not only is it because it's a McFarlane Toys Store exclusive, and that's the only avenue as of the recording of this video, the only real way to purchase it, but it's also got the aesthetic of the animated series Batman, one that's very difficult to ignore, not just from its design standpoint, not only here in vehicle toy format, but also from the way it's designed inside of the panels for the DC Rebirth comic series. And we've seen that happen time and time again, where you have a little bit of bleed in between the live action versions of certain either vehicles or characters or gadgetry, then seeping into the comic realm because it's successful, it was marketed very nicely, and then we have the whole thing kind of happening vice versa. And it looks like a similar thing happened with Rebirth, where you can note that the back half of the vehicle is mostly straightforward, the animated series design, as far as the fins kind of jetting towards the back with this kind of very, bullet car sort of aesthetic to it. The canopy, it's just straightforward animated series Batman. There's no other way to really describe it. With that said, there's definitely some applications as far as the surface of the paneling and the armor, and even a few little design choices that they managed to distinguish it from not being just a cookie cutter replication of the animated series Batman. If you take a closer look at the canopy and the windows, you'll notice that they designed like these little raised grooves of the actual outline of the window that's not just as straightforward as it is on the animated series one. So of course you're going to have those little angles, and it gets a little narrower towards the backside there. In terms of, just like I said, giving off that animated series vibe, it's 100% found there, but at least on the surface, you got this, in my opinion, really well done and nicely textured matte finish that's really cool to the touch as far as the solid nature of the plastic. And it's something that's doing an awful lot of the heavy lifting for the vehicle, because even though it is kind of carrying on over another little factor that I've always been a little harsh on regarding the vehicles as of late, specifically, like I mentioned before, that Pattinson Batmobile, a little bit of the Tumbler, is that more often than not, they come off as hollow shells that just happen to have a small plastic rig inside that's holding the metal rods that then connect the wheels to each other, the front two and then the front back. At least here, I don't know what kind of witchcraft, maybe it has something to do with the texture kind of here on the surface with this matted, very, like I said, gripping texture that gives it an added level of heft and weight that at least dissipates a little bit of the illusion that this is a hollow shell. I understand that it's a hollow shell. There's no internals, and there's most definitely no lights and sounds, which is why I find it just a little bit misleading to have a bit of a light glow, light, lens flare effect on the front little eyes here towards this design, towards the front, on the back of the packaging, that you can most definitely not replicate in real life. So I kind of wish that they would have omitted that, because I frankly don't like the optics of that. But when you're able to look past that, like I mentioned before, I don't know if maybe it's because of the fact that this is a much more cylindrical and narrower design to the Batmobile as opposed to the chunkiness that is the muscle car, Pattinson Batman, or the Tumbler, but it just feels much more compact and solid to me than those prior two iterations, and therefore it's doing a little bit of an easier job sort of impressing me, or it could just be my bias towards the animated series that's winning me over. And like I mentioned before, an awful lot of like the designs to make it look like it's a bunch of like metal sheets grafted and tooled and drilled together, along with these little like rivets that are connecting them, besides the lining of the panels to kind of give it that look, the vents over here on over to the side, and you even have the little bit of detail with the gas tank cover, the cap, on the right side that is missing from the left, to again give it a little bit of life, a little bit of presence to it. And keeping the animated series influence alive, even though it's taking its own liberties to then apply to the DC Rebirth design, would have to be pretty much everything that's going back here that I most thoroughly really do enjoy, even though it's just a glorified panel on the top side with a piece of glossier-ish plastic applied to it that is now kind of giving us the illusion of the turbine with the Spitfire towards the back here, where you have a little bit of this design with the little gears, panels, and grooves to then emulate this little Spitfire effect, along with the little tubes that then connect to it, some exhaust towards the sides here, vents, and then of course the tail lights, and even the brake light here towards the top. I don't know what it is, but maybe it's the contrast of the glossy finish, semi-glossy finish to the taillights and the brake light matching up against the sides of the, like I mentioned before, the texturized black plastic surrounding it, that to me, I don't know what it is. It just kind of gives this much more solid feel and look that I personally prefer than that of some of the more recent Batmobiles that have been released. I don't know. Maybe it's something that is within McFarlane's wheelhouse, where if he's doing vehicles, I feel like he's at his most strongest regarding comic book based adaptations as opposed to live action ones, because notice that an awful lot of the complaints I've been having is mostly on the cinematic ones, which is kind of ironic considering that those were probably the ones that were in most demand. When we then take a close look at the front half of the vehicle is when we get our biggest differences, not just within this DC Multiverse vehicle, but also the way it's portrayed in the DC Rebirth comics, where they try to separate it as best as possible to the animated series one so that they can possibly avoid copyright, but most importantly, make it its own unique thing. And it doesn't get much more unique than having a legitimate bat head at the front here. A little detail that I gotta be honest, I'm on the minority for. I personally do not like it, but again, that's more so of a harp on the design of it inside of the DC Rebirth comic. I never really liked it whenever Batman has like a bat-ish thing, a legitimate animal bat head or ears or anything like that. Nevertheless, at least here, realized in plastic, they did a pretty good job of making it feel much more of a solid piece as opposed to just being a cheap piece of plastic, a cheap kind of add-on tacked on to the front of the hood here that is at least faithful to the way it's done in the comics. So it's made out of a glossy finish along with the cutout white eyes. You have a little bit of this engine piece here towards the top, and overall it's definitely got an alluring presence to it, even if I'm not the biggest fan of the design itself. And then on over to the sides, of course, you're going to have the much broader guards or fins or whatever you want to really call this front fender part that is then covering our wheels. That then leads us to pretty much all of the engine pieces and all of the little turbines and spinning discs here towards the top. That is, again, not only faithful to the way that it's done in the comics, but it's made out of this like marbleized, opaque, grayish plastic that's much glossier than the texture and makes it stand out. Unfortunately, this also leads to a bit of a symptom that I've seen happen time and time again with this sort of style to the marbleized plastic, to where certain concentrated crevices and corners lead to this little like marble effect that then looks a little ugly. It looks almost like a QC problem. You have little areas where it gets kind of dark and saturated. I don't know if it's like a chemical imbalance or something in the manufacturing that is practically unavoidable. This is just something that's going to happen. I understand you could probably minimize the amount of times that it happens, but here, if you start to squint the eyes and take a closer look and really scrutinize the vehicle, you are going to come across it. So just a word of caution there if you are a bit of a perfectionist like I tend to be. And while scanning this piece made me realize that this is actually your way to activate the opening canopy by pressing the farthermost disc that is then disguising as a button to press, and thus giving us access to the inside of the cockpit. And a word of caution, you do have to give the canopy a slight little tug upwards to then slide it forwards, because the front tab that it locks in does kind of get in the way of the button, so a little bit of futzing is required. And though it is a one-seater, and of course the majority of the plastic found therein for the seat, for the wheel, it's pretty standard issue from the prior Batmobiles they've come across, they at least added a few more details, a little bit of attention to the sprockets and meters and speedometers and all that jazz, all the little indicators and the digital clocks and screens for the sticker decals that are then applied therein. There's nothing crazy as far as sculpting or anything like that, but at least Batman's going to be surrounded by more so flair that you're accustomed to having inside of a cockpit for a Batmobile. And much like the prior ones, you're going to have an awful lot of real estate down below to then fit any of the prior Batmans that you really want to fit into your DC Rebirth Batmobile. But of course, the one that's probably going to be the most favorable to do so and have a much more fonder experience is going to be the Batman that we just covered and compared to the prior releases, which is, of course, the most recent McFarlane Toys Store exclusive with the cloth cape, which is thankfully not that bad of an experience, considering that you are going to have to risk wrinkling and sort of scrimping up a little bit of the cape from the backside there, which is, of course, not helped by any part the lack of a wire, because at least the wire will then help out straightening the cape when you finally take the guy out. And once you get him seated in there, he's looking forward and oriented in a careful position that at least fits natural to the cockpit. And it's more than what I can say for any attempts with the rubberized cape, because naturally that cape is just going to be bouncing. It's going to make the whole thing really terrible for any of the prior iterations that are then holding the rubberized cape in place. It's obviously, this is ultimately the biggest justification for why McFarlane redesigned and reissued the Rebirth Batman, is to have a cloth cape that can then fit inside the DC Rebirth Batmobile. And this is probably the biggest talking point, the biggest argumentative detail as to why it is that maybe if you're going to be picking up this Batman, this brand new 5th version of the DC Rebirth Batman, Gold Label exclusive, then you might as well do it packed in with the DC Rebirth vehicle. Even if maybe the vehicle itself is going to give you some flashes of deja vu should you already have the animated series DC Direct vehicle that McFarlane also issued out a little while ago. I want to say it was maybe last year, the year before that. Something that reinforces that fact or that notion, that theory, so to speak, is that you also have this front piece here, something that I kind of wanted to touch upon before I forget, is that you do require a little bit of assembly pulling it out of the box. This front piece is actually removed as its own separate piece, and you have to kind of plop it back in, and it doesn't feel super snug or intuitive clipping it into the grooves that it's supposed to be snug and tight. So it's a little strange that not only you have to do this in the first place, but it doesn't assemble itself all too carefully. Once you kind of get it situated, at least the front here feels a little flush, but it's actually at the bottom on the underside that then gives you access to the undergarments of the vehicle that, again, like I mentioned before, just look pretty standard with the usual decorative piping that is sculpted into the plastic, along with this really very self-important bat symbol there at the bottom that obviously nobody's going to look at, but naturally Batman's going to still put it brand it on the vehicle itself. But this again called attention to the little tab for the front here that didn't clip all the way through and doesn't feel as intuitive to assemble than it is to even put Batman in there in the first place. So naturally, the second thing that sort of popped into my brain is exactly why it is that that piece is separated altogether. Why couldn't it all just be one vehicle? And again, that just kind of lends to the theory that this is in fact just a repurposed animated series Batmobile that they took out the blueprint for, reissued it, kind of give it some touch-ups as far as the texture work here. That definitely feels pretty solid and good in hand and gives it this holistic feel that doesn't feel like it's a cheaped out version of the animated series Batman, but then restructured this front piece and therefore 3D, I guess I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but manufactured it on the side to then get packed into the box so that then you can clip it and assemble it yourself. But it doesn't make it any easier to ignore the question why this couldn't just be either incorporated on its own through manufacturing, especially since this is in fact a McFarlane Toys Store exclusive for now. I don't know if that's going to change later in the future. God only knows if this guy starts popping up in Ross's or DD's later down the line going into 2026. But for now, if it's such an exclusive and you only have to make a certain set amount, why did it take so long to ship? Why does assembly need to be required out of the box? And at the price point that it is by itself, which I believe is $90, it's still pretty steep. I'm at least more happy with it than I was with the prior two releases. I can definitely, from my gut, say that this is a better Batmobile and does a much better impressionable job on me than the Pattinson Batmobile did, than hell, maybe even the Tumbler did. Especially since, like I said, it's kind of tapping a little bit into my bias towards the animated series. But at least this thing looks a little bit better in person than I was giving it credit for initially, especially since it's already doing some design choices that I wasn't very favorable or fond of from the comic book. An omission of any kind of like lights and sounds gimmick, which I'm not necessarily saying should have been required here. But I think that for that price and for the fact that that DC Rebirth Batman is simply just swapping out a rubber cape for a cloth one. You're smoothing out the bat symbol on the front on his chest. You definitely have more accessories, but it's accessories that were already included inside of the DC Rebirth Digital figure that was released last year. There's still more questions being posed than there are answers that honestly make all around sense, that I think that the ultimate solution should have been to charge this at $90, but toss in the Batman figure for free. If you're not going to include lights and sounds, okay, understandable, since this is in fact a vehicle lifted from a comic book. You're not going to be able to truly interpret lights or sounds. That makes much more sense for cinematic Batmobiles from the movies because we know how they sound, we know how they look. But for that price range, you need to be offering up something more. And I think that including that figure as a package deal from the get-go, as opposed to being a selling point as its own separate product page, and then having two other product pages, not just for the vehicle, but also for the figure separately, probably wouldn't have been the wisest choice. But I understand that they are in the sunset year of the DC license. They have to take the money as much as I can get, and ultimately it's the consumer that needs to make that choice. And that's why I made the choice to buy the package deal, but also utilize a $20 certificate that I had saved up and my 10% discount as a platinum member, which I also got for free through the McFarlane Toys event. So I'm definitely going to be making moves to make sure that I get this guy as little as money down as possible, because I frankly feel that that's where its value is attributed. And that value also gets translated in the form of a 7 out of 10 rating for an overall bundle deal, because the vehicle itself is truly a 7 out of 10. The Batman is more so like a 6, or borderline a 5, considering that not much has changed and some things didn't necessarily work out for the better. Like I said, you ended up not giving us a sculpted bat symbol that you've already done in the past. You definitely have much more accessories included with the alternate Bruce Wayne, but no wire inside the cape. Definitely a whole lot of missed opportunity there. But credit where credit is due, I definitely like this Batmobile much more than the most recent releases from the vehicle line, but also made me kind of theorized that if maybe the Batmobiles from the DC Multiverse series come out better from being comic book interpretations or simply just not being part of any kind of movie property, any kind of like live action interpretation, then maybe there's still hope that we can get a solid release of an Arkham universe sort of representation in vehicle form. I know that pragmatically it makes more sense to make the Arkham Knight tank Batmobile, but man, oh man, what it would be like to get an Arkham Batmobile from Arkham Asylum, because that's my preferred version of that beast. But I understand that considering its short screen time and lack of real functionality, like it, as opposed to the way that it was interpreted in Arkham Knight, I should probably just stash those streams at this point. But what do you guys think? What kind of vehicle going forward do you want to see McFarlane Toys? I might have already asked this question a number of times, but say that the cinematic universe, the Batman live action Batmobiles have been done and completed since the 1966 DC Multiverse 7-inch scaled Batmobile is just around the corner. It's been recently teased at like a Canadian expo that McFarlane attended, and so it's probably going to be going up for pre-order relatively soon, if not already by the time that this video goes out. So should we interpret the live action Batmobiles to have been completed? What version from either the comics or hell even the games do you want to see McFarlane tackle for a DC Multiverse Batmobile before the license is up in mid of 2026? Let me know down in the comment section while you guys are down there. Hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review of this 2-pack. Let me know if you didn't like it by hitting the thumbs down. And of course, as always, stay humble, and I'll see you guys later.